Good morning, all you happy 514ers. Are you feeling vibrant today? Great. I'm so happy to be here and to be the academic who's going to talk to you about why research matters and what research tells us. Before I start, the first thing I do want to say is I acknowledge the ancestral lands of the Mississaugas of New Credit First Nations. And I wouldn't be really very appropriate in talking about rights and resilience if I didn't also acknowledge the very critical issue of murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. So I'm happy today to talk to you about this time in our world that's a time of opportunities. With the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child articulating all the rights that children and youth have, we have a consensus global document. Virtually all countries signed on to this convention, and now we have goals. They're called the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. And I think the individuals quite wisely put the right to not be exposed to violence in the goal called the peace and institutions. So by 2030, we have a very ambitious goal to offer youth peace. The Canadian Institutes of Health and Research, the Institute of Gender and Health, and the Public Health Agency of Canada has funded a team that you can follow us via Twitter hashtag CHRTeamSV, and we're tasked to really look into the issue of sexual violence victimization of males and young male adults, male youth and adults. Underattended area. So telling the story of research is really listening to the stories of youth. I know when we think about research, we think big data, data points, crunching numbers. As a researcher in child welfare, I'm keenly aware that every data point is a youth voice, and it might be easier for youth to tell us about their lives by clicking a checkbox. And that when we have, as Article 12 says, basically the right to participation, and we've heard that today from the youth speakers, being able to participate in research is one way for us to capture youth voices. And by having those youth voices, we are in a better position to match and tailor services to need. And once we ask the questions, we really have to be able to hear the answers. And psychologists like to do psychological things. So as you stare at the diagram, you will see the experience a little bit of the researcher. As you get more and more information, things start to shift and move. It can feel like movable pieces and shifting sands. And rather than think of being sent down, hurtled down the rabbit hole, I like to see something like this as moving towards the light at the end of the tunnel. Yes, that tunnel, as we've heard, has some dark places, but greater knowledge will take us towards that light. And as Amanda noted, these are challenging topics, but these difficult, important conversations are critical for us to have. The numbers demand that we have this conversation, with 70 million boys estimated to have been victims of sexual violence and 120 girls worldwide. those numbers with people behind them, with youth behind them, are screaming at us to talk about that, to be brave enough to ask those questions. And globally, we are so pleased that we are all a part of this global partnership to end violence. When we start to ask questions, we find things that we didn't know. And this includes trauma, as Margaret was talking about, the multiple layers of trauma that we may not know about. But what we do know about is what we see in front of us. And we may see acting out behaviors. We may know of diagnoses, but we might not know that that's just a tip of an iceberg, and that there's many other small t day-to-day trauma events and large T trauma events that have occurred. We have to really be willing to ask what's in that invisible suitcase of not just challenges but strengths that youth walk around with. The Maltreatment and Adolescent Pathways MAP study originated because we actually didn't know very much about the mental health, the physical health, and health risks of child welfare involved youth. And I have to again thank our funder, CIHR, the Ontario Ministry of Child and Youth Services, Ontario Centre of Excellence in Child and Mental Health, the Ontario Mental Health Foundation for their support. And we randomly selected 561 youth and followed them over 2 to 3 years to understand what was going on in their lives, talking to them every 6 months. This particular slice of data that I'm wanting to talk about, we looked at youth who told us that they were sexually active, and we asked about their childhood sexual abuse experiences, recognizing that youth don't disclose all things at all times, and as you age, you gain in cognitive capacities for abstraction. Your task is identity formation. You reconsider things that have happened before. As Margaret talked about, the early years are so important, and the next big important year for brain development is adolescence. So these mid-adolescents who are sexually active, out of 297, 43% told us they had experienced sexual abuse. Primarily, the most common item was being coerced to touch someone or being coerced to allow someone to touch you. What was interesting is that within the questionnaire, there is a self-labeling question. I was sexually abused. So even though they may have endorsed those items, a minority, particularly boys, labeled it as sexual abuse. So we want to think about what that means for our practices as youth at this age are more orienting towards engaging in sex and romantic relationships. So we have a particular developmental timing. We want to know how this might impact health risk behaviors, and we found that youth who self-reported these sexual abuse experiences did have higher health risk behaviors. And we did something interesting. We asked them why they were having sex. So, because psychologists like to make up questionnaires, there's some motives for sex, motives for drinking, motives for drug use. And so we asked youth why they were having sex. And child welfare youth without child sexual abuse experiences were more likely to say they were seeking pleasure. Those youth who had child sexual abuse experience gave many more reasons as to why they were having sex. They gave that reason, but they also said they were having sex for peer approval, especially the boys. They were having sex for partner approval. They were having sex to cope with their negative emotions. Both girls and boys were telling us this. And when we looked at that relationship between their childhood sexual abuse experiences and their adolescent health risk behaviors, we found that the bridging variable was indeed a motive to cope. and having sex to cope with negative emotionality. So whenever we find these mediating variables, it focuses our attentions very sharply on saying, this high-level emotionality, this day-to-day level emotionality, and how that plays out in relationships, this is something we have to pay attention to. And I just give you the link there. I imagine these slides will be available if you want to see an overview of all of the MAP findings, or many more of them. And this talk about youth, well, the adage, not about us without us, applies here. And I will be showing you a clip from a 14-year-old young lady from Halifax. Her title is, "It's Not Boys Will Be Boys." And I can't even imagine this context that we live in where adolescents look to spin doctors who say, boys will be boys, it's just locker room talk. And then see that people go on to achieve high levels of power. Powerful. And one of the things that Kaylee, I had an opportunity to connect with her, and she was thrilled that you would be seeing this. One of the things that she talks about is after a trauma, you just want to go home. And the research that we just saw, it really asks the questions, are we creating the kind of education opportunities for youth to be able to feel like their bodies, their personhood is a home? So when they move around, they're moving with their own home. So to see where we're at today, we have trauma experiences, which may or may not lead to trauma reactions. The trauma reactions mean that there are very high levels of negative emotionality that's challenging to cope with. There's always resilience. Wherever there's survivorship, there is resilience. But if we really are wanting to galvanize resilience, it means we've offered resources. We have that caring teacher who knows how to respond. And if a youth disclosed, they would know how to provide an empathic response and the actions that would be taken next. It means that we are having mentors for youth, child welfare workers with whom they can positively identify. And it means that we have evidence-based resources like trauma-focused CBT. We're giving them our best. And the main resilience factor is stable, nurturing relationships. And what is critically important is that we support the learning of the skill set of self-compassion, particularly for child welfare youth, that they approach their mistakes, their challenges with a loving kindness, and that they know that through connecting, they feel their own mattering, because if they matter, they are willing to take that risk to move with the crowd, to move with their group, hang on and get a little help from their friends as they go. And we bring back the global goals that we all are agreeing upon and committed to, and call to action for youth rights and resilience, particularly targeting sexual violence, to end violence against girls and boys, to give safe places and ways to tell, to reinforce survivor resilience with resources, to bring forward resilience, and to support self-compassion and social connection. I hope you join me in working towards those 2030 goals to offer peace to youth. Thank you.